Good evening, friends. Come in. It's good to have your company tonight. Get yourselves comfortable wherever you are, and let the day loosen its grip a little. It can manage without you until morning. One small thing before we set off. There are no ads here, and there never will be. Nothing tonight is going to interrupt you or startle you awake. That promise stays alive because of you. A quiet follow, a kind word left behind somewhere. It matters more than you'd guess. Tonight, we're going to the Greenwood. But first, go back to where each of us actually met him. Because most of us met Robin Hood before we could read. Maybe he was a fox with a sly voice in a Saturday morning movie. Maybe he lived in a picture book with the corners worn soft and arrived at night, the mattress dipping as someone we loved sat down on the edge of the bed and did a different voice for the sheriff, while we begged for one more chapter and lost the fight to stay awake before he ever got away. Or maybe an older cousin, out in the yard, showed us how to bend a stick into a bow. However he arrived, nobody can remember being introduced. He was simply there, like a relative. The green hood, the longbow, rob from the rich, give to the poor. And we carried him out of childhood without ever once asking where he came from. So here is what I'd like to do tonight. Keep that Robin close. The one from the bedtime book, the one from the backyard. Because the Robin in the oldest poems, the real old ones, written down 500 years ago in ink that is still there, is someone stranger and funnier and far better company than we were ever told. He loses fights he ought to win. He risks his neck to get to church on time. He lends money of all things, and heaven help the abbey that doesn't honour the repayment. And every so often tonight, I'm going to stand the two of them side by side, the Robin we remember and the Robin the old ink remembers, and let them look at each other. And underneath him, in the actual records of medieval England, there is a mystery, a real one, still unsolved, that I'll unfold between the tales, a little at a time. Because the oldest trace of Robin Hood ever found is not a story at all, but a slip of a clerk's pen in a government ledger, more than a century before the first story anyone has found. A name that was already famous before anyone wrote down why. So tonight, you get the old tales themselves, told the way they were meant to be told, one after another. A whole outlaw's life of them. And between the tales, the strangest paper trail in English history. And all the way through, I'll be honest with you about which parts are solid ground, which parts the scholars still argue over, and which pieces of the legend arrived late. Because Marion, the friar, even Sherwood itself, all have arrival dates, and some of them will surprise you. So come with me then, north and a long way back, to a summer morning on the old high road. Begin with the world, because the world explains everything that happens in it. Picture the north of England 700 years ago. Not the castles, just the country. Oak and birch running unbroken for miles, and one great road threading through it. The high road from London to Scotland, dropping down a wooded hillside to cross a little river called the Went. Everyone who travelled the north came through there eventually. Merchants with their pack horses, monks riding between abbeys with saddlebags full of rent money, knights, potters, pilgrims, and all of them slowed right there where the road narrowed at the river crossing, under a wooded lookout the old poems call the Salis. Slow travellers, thick trees, and money moving north and south. A road like that collects stories the way a river bend collects driftwood. And the law of that world was strange in ways worth knowing before the first tale. Great stretches of that countryside were forest in the legal sense, the king's hunting ground, where the deer mattered more than the men, and things a hungry man might do on an ordinary day were crimes against the crown. And when a man failed to answer the courts, the law had one word that solved him like an arithmetic problem: outlaw, outside the law. His goods forfeit, his protection gone, his life from that morning on lived among the trees. The records of the age are full of such men, and nearly all of them are utterly forgotten, which makes it all the stranger that the one everybody remembers is remembered, above everything, for his manners. Because that is the first thing the old poems insist on. Lithe and listen, gentlemen, the great one begins. I shall you tell of a good yeoman. His name was Robehod. A yeoman, a free countryman, neither peasant nor lord. And, the poem says it straight out, so courteous an outlaw was never none found. His rules were plain. Bishops and fat abbots and the high sheriff of Nottingham were fair game, but no harm was to come to any farmer that tilled with his plough, nor to any honest yeoman, nor to a knight or squire willing to be a good fellow. And no company with a woman in it was to be troubled at all, for Robin, says the poem, loved our dear Lady, the Virgin Mary, and for dread of deadly sin would never harm a company a woman was in. A devout, polite, careful highwayman. Notice the childhood rule is almost there. The rich have reason to worry, and the humble are safe. But the second half, the giving to the poor half, is nowhere in it. And where that half of the code actually came from is one of tonight's quiet surprises. Hold the old code in mind then, and let me tell you the best story anyone ever told about this man. Robin Hood had a peculiar habit, and the whole first tale hangs on it. He would not sit down to dinner until he had a guest. So on this day, he sends Little John and two of the others up to the road, with instructions that are pure Robin. Walk up to the Salis, wait by the way, and bring me someone for dinner. Be it earl or baron, abbot or knight, bring him down to the lodge. And what comes down the road is a knight, but no one's picture of a knight. His clothes are shabby. One foot sits in the stirrup and the other swings loose. His hood hangs down over his eyes, and he rides the way a man rides when he has stopped caring where the horse goes. The poem says no sorrier man ever rode on a summer's day. They bring him down to dinner, a good dinner, bread and wine and venison that was, strictly speaking, the king's. And when it is over, Robin, ever courteous, raises the small matter of the bill. A yeoman feeding a knight, he suggests pleasantly, is the world upside down. Perhaps the knight would care to pay for them both. And the knight goes quiet, and finally tells the truth. He has 10 shillings to his name. Little John goes through the saddlebags, because courtesy is one thing and business is another, and it is true. So Robin does not rob him. He asks him how. And out comes the story. A good son who killed a man, the ruinous cost of saving him from the gallows, and a debt of £400 to the abbot of St. Mary's Abbey in York, secured against everything the knight owns in the world. The payment is due within days. If he misses it, the abbot keeps the land, and the abbot, the knight says plainly, has been counting the days with pleasure. As for friends, he had plenty while the money lasted. They have made themselves remarkably hard to find. Now, remember who Robin loves. He asks the knight what security he could offer against a loan, and the knight, scraping the bottom, answers that he has none in this world. None but Our Lady. And that settles it on the spot. Robin declares the Virgin Mary the finest security in all England. He would take her word over any man's gold, and tells little John to count out £400 from the treasury chest. What follows is the gentlest scene in any outlaw story ever written. John counts generously, letting the pile run a little past the mark, and dares anyone to object. They notice the knight's clothes are a disgrace, so out comes cloth for a new suit, and John measures the yards with his bowstave, hopping along the cloth, allowing 3 feet to every one. Then a fresh horse, new boots, spurs. And when the knight asks when the loan falls due, Robin sets the term like a man naming a feast day. A year from today, under this greenwood tree. The sorriest man on the road rides away sitting straight in the saddle. Meanwhile, in York, the Abbot of St. Mary's is doing arithmetic of his own. The poem seats him at his table, working through the calendar, and gives him one of the coldest lines in medieval poetry. Unless he come this very day, disinherited he shall be. The knight arrives on the last day, deliberately late, deliberately dressed poor, and kneels and opens, as a test, with a plea for mercy. More time to pay. The abbot refuses him in front of the whole table. Even the prior of the abbot's own house objects out loud that taking a man's land this way is a shame, and is told to mind his business. And when the performance has run its full course, the knight gets up off his knees, stops pretending, and pays out £400 onto the table, like a man laying down a winning hand. "Have your land again," he says. The poem never needs to raise its voice, and he rides home, as the verse puts it, singing. Behind him the abbot sits very still, looking at a pile of money he wanted a great deal less than the land. A year later, to the day, Robin is under his tree, and true to form he will not dine until his money arrives. And here the story allows itself a long, slow grin. Because who should come down from the Salis but a monk of St. Mary's Abbey, York, of all the houses in England, riding high-horsed with a train of servants, and, once little John has had a look through the packs, £800 in the baggage. Robin asks the monk, politely, whether he happens to carry anything toward the repayment of a certain loan his abbey's patroness stood surety for. The monk knows nothing of any loan, so Robin lays it out for him the way you might explain a bill to a slow customer. The Virgin Mary guaranteed £400. This money rides under her house's banner, and here is exactly twice the sum, arrived exactly on the day. Our Lady, Robin announces to the whole camp, delighted, is the truest guarantor in England. She has repaid him double. The monk continues his journey considerably lighter, and when the knight himself arrives that evening with the £400, apologising for cutting it fine, Robin refuses the money flat. The debt is settled, he explains. The lady paid it herself, and it would be poor manners to collect twice. That is the heart of the oldest Robin Hood we have, and it is worth noticing what it is, and what it is not. There is no robbing the rich to give to the poor in it. There is a loan, honoured with interest, at the expense of exactly one wealthy abbey that tried to swallow a man's land whole. It is a story about debt and courtesy and a bookkeeping miracle. The world's most famous outlaw, in his founding tale, is essentially a banker with a longbow. And his politeness is the joke the entire tradition runs on. The unsettling thing about Robin Hood was never the violence. It was that he treated robbery as hospitality. Dinner first, always, and the reckoning after. Now let me show you the first piece of the paper trail, because while those verses were being sung, real clerks were keeping real ledgers, and something very odd is sitting in them. In the summer of 1225, the king's justices held court at York, and a man called Robehod, a tenant on the archbishop's lands, failed to appear. The law did its arithmetic: fugitive, goods forfeit. And the following year, the royal treasury recorded the yield. One line of cramped Latin in the great annual audit. The Sheriff of Yorkshire owes 32 shillings and sixpence from the chattels of Robehod, fugitive. That is all. No crime named, no bow, no forest, no green. Just a bookkeeping line. And yet it is, by the reckoning of the people who have searched longest, the single most promising trace of a real Robin Hood that 7 centuries of looking has ever turned up. Because the line would not die. The debt was never paid, so clerks copied it forward, roll after roll, 9 years running. And as they copied, the name began to drift. Robehod, Robert Hood. And twice, in 1227 and 28, a treasury clerk wrote him down as Robehod. Hob being a pet name for Robert in those days, the way Robin was. A nickname creeping into a tax document, a little like finding a doodle in an audit. The people who know these roles best allow themselves exactly one careful sentence about it. That nickname may well reflect the emergence of the legend. May well. Nobody can prove it. Clerks garbled names constantly, and the scholars say so first. But there it sits on the parchment, a government ledger quietly turning a man into something that sounds like a story. And that same summer, the accounts record a manhunt. A royal writ, the 12th of July, 1225, naming a second Robert. Seek and take Robert of Wetherby, outlaw and evildoer of our land. The sheriff hired a professional, a hunter of men, and the ledgers itemized the pursuit the way ledgers do. 40 shillings for the chase, 28 more when it dragged into a second season, and at the very end, one final line, quite small, 2 shillings for a chain. The chain was for the body. Wetherby was caught, beheaded, and hung in chains for display. Treatment the age saved for men it wanted made an example of. Whatever he had done, somebody wanted it remembered. Was Robert of Wetherby the same man as Robehod of the pipe roll? The dates interlock, the county matches, nobody can prove it, and the archivists who found all this are the first to say so. But here is the detail that has kept scholars awake for 40 years. The official who ran that manhunt, a career administrator named Eustace of Lodham, was Yorkshire's deputy sheriff only briefly. Before and after, his career belonged to another county. He had been, and would soon again be, Sheriff of Nottingham. Sit with that one a moment. The oldest poems contain a famous geographical absurdity. A Yorkshire outlaw hunted, for no reason the stories ever explain, by the Sheriff of Nottingham, 50 miles out of his jurisdiction. 700 years of retellings have shrugged at it, and in the real records of the real summer of 1225, there he is, a Nottingham sheriff, hunting a Yorkshire outlaw to his death. A story does not need to invent a contradiction like that, but a story that grew out of a real season of real paperwork might simply have remembered it. Back to the Greenwood and the second tale, the oldest complete Robin Hood story that survives anywhere on Earth, and it begins, like all the best family stories, with an argument about money. It is early summer. The poem opens on it, 4 lines that people have loved for 500 years. In summer, when the woods are bright and the leaves are large and long, it is full merry in the fair forest to hear the small birds' song. Now, the merry men of our childhood laughed all day. That is practically what merry meant. The real band, in its oldest story, opens by arguing about money, like a family at a kitchen table. Under those bright leaves, Robin and Little John fall out over an archery wager, 5 shillings, and it goes the way money arguments go. Robin, losing and in the wrong, and knowing it, strikes him. And John, magnificent in his dignity, quits on the spot. "Get yourself a man where you will," he says, "for you get me no more." So Robin Hood walks into Nottingham alone and mourning, and not to rob anyone. He goes because it has been a fortnight and more, the poem says, since he last saw his saviour. He is going into the one town in England where every man knows his face, to hear Mass at St. Mary's Church. It is worth taking in slowly. The earliest complete Robin Hood story is not about treasure. It is about a wanted man so hungry for the sacrament that he walks through the sheriff's own streets for it and kneels before the rood, with the whole town around him like a closed hand. And of course, he is seen. A great-headed monk, the poem calls him, a man Robin once robbed of £100, who has carried the receipt folded in his heart ever since, spots the outlaw at his prayers, slips out, and raises the town. The doors fill with the sheriff's men. Robin's sword takes down 12 of them before it breaks, snaps clean on the sheriff's skull, and he curses the smith who forged it, and the poem is grinning even here. And then, nothing. Not because the story flinched, but because at exactly this moment, the one surviving copy of the poem loses a page. A single leaf, perhaps 48 lines, fell out of the manuscript somewhere in the last 5 centuries, precisely at the capture, and so no one alive, not one person in 800 years of loving this legend, has ever read how Robin Hood was taken. The text simply resumes elsewhere, out under the trees, with the outlaws staggering at the news that their master is in prison. Somewhere, maybe, that lost page still exists, pressed flat in the binding of some unexamined old book, the way lost pages sometimes are. Or it went into a fire 400 years ago. Either way, the oldest story keeps its central wound private, and I confess I hope the page is never found. Some doors are better standing open. The rescue is not a battle. It is a con, and it is run on the King of England himself. Little John, the man who quit, and this is the point of him, intercepts the monk carrying the news south to the court. What happens on that road, the poem tells in 4 flat lines. And I will be honest with you the way I promised. John kills the monk, and Much, the miller's son, kills the monk's little page, so that no witness reaches the court. The verse spends no more feeling on it than a woodsman spends on a rabbit. and modern readers find that harder than the medieval ones seem to have. It is worth knowing plainly that the hero England chose could do that in his oldest story. The Greenwood was never a theme park. Then John rides on to the king, carrying the monk's own letters. The monk, he explains truthfully, died on the way. And the king, finding the letters genuine and the messenger charming, rewards little John, swears him in as a yeoman of the crown, and sends him back north carrying the royal privy seal, which John presents at the gates of Nottingham, telling the sheriff, with a straight face, that the monk could not come because the king has made him abbot of Westminster. The sheriff, honoured by all this royal attention, throws a feast. That night, John kills the jailer, unlocks the cell, and carries Robin Hood over the town wall. When the whole embarrassment finally reaches the king, the poem gives him one of the finest endings in medieval literature. Not rage, something far better. He looks at what has happened, his own seal, his own generosity, his own sheriff, all played like instruments, and says of little John, he is true to his master. He loves Robin Hood better than he loves any of us. John has beguiled us all. And back in the Greenwood, when Robin offers him leadership of the band in gratitude, John turns it down in one line that tells you why these stories have lasted 500 years. "Let me be a fellow," he says, "nothing more." And here is the wonder, after the tale instead of before it. That whole story, the quarrel, the mass, the missing page, the king beguiled, survives in exactly one copy. One stained, cramped manuscript in Cambridge, written out around 1465. Most likely, the scholars think, by a young country priest copying it into his personal notebook. The oldest Robin Hood story on earth exists because one young clergyman, somewhere in the Midlands, privately wanted his own copy of a poem where the outlaws kill a monk. Whatever that says about him, it probably says the same about all of us. The third tale is the comedy, and it opens with the most reassuring thing the tradition ever tells us about itself. Robin Hood loses a fight. A travelling potter has been using the Barnesdale Road for years and has never once paid the outlaw's toll, a point of some professional embarrassment. And when Robin steps out to collect, staff against staff, the potter beats him soundly, in front of his own men, who find it wonderful. Little John, who took his own beating from this same potter at Wentbridge a while back, wins 40 shillings on the outcome and does not let anyone forget it. So Robin does the Robin thing. If you cannot beat the potter, become him. He buys the man's cart and his whole stock, puts on his clothes, and drives into Nottingham, where he sets up a pottery stall directly opposite the sheriff's gate and proceeds to be the worst businessman the town has ever seen. 5-penny pots at 3 pence, prices so mad the housewives crowd round, whispering that yonder potter shall never thrive. He sells out by noon, naturally, and the last pots he sends as a gift to the sheriff's wife, with a gold ring in the bargain, and she, delighted, gets him invited to dinner at the castle. At the sheriff's own table, and this is the same sheriff we all booed as children before we could have said why, talk turns to archery, and the potter allows that he knows a little of the bow, then wins the contest in the yard, complaining that the sheriff's bows are right weak gear and splitting the peg in 3. If a memory stirs there, a trick shot we all watched as kids, one arrow splitting another down the middle, This is its great-grandfather, 500 years old and already showing off. Then he mentions, conversationally, that the bow in his cart was a gift from Robin Hood himself. The sheriff leans in. Could this Potter perhaps lead the law to that villain? The Potter supposes he could. Everyone sees it coming. Every listener for 500 years has seen it coming, and that is the pleasure of it. Deep in the greenwood, the Potter blows a horn, the trees produce armed men, and the Sheriff of Nottingham loses his horse, his gear, and every shred of his dignity, but not his life. This is the daylight register, nobody dies in it, and is sent home on foot. And his wife meets him at the gate, takes one look at the whole disaster, and delivers, laughing, the driest line in early English poetry. Now have you paid for all the pots that Robin gave to me? Robin, for his part, pays the real Potter £10 for a cartload worth a fraction of it. Everyone ends the story richer except the sheriff, who ends it educated. And notice her, in passing, the sheriff's laughing wife. She is the only flesh and blood woman in all the earliest tales. No Marian anywhere, not yet, and not for a long time. Which brings us to the last tales the old poem tells, the king and the ending. Word of the outlaw who robs abbots and feeds strangers eventually reaches the crown itself. We are back in the long poem now, the one with the knight and the lone, and its king, whom it calls Edward, our comely king, comes north to see about it personally. And being the king in a Robin Hood story, he does it the only sensible way, in disguise. He dresses as an abbot, which, when you think about who Robin robs, is either very brave or very poorly advised, and rides into the greenwood, where he is, of course, promptly invited to dinner. There is a meal and an archery game with forfeits, and at the appointed moment the abbot's hood comes back, and Robin Hood finds himself kneeling in front of his king. And the king, who has now personally experienced the famous courtesy, eaten the venison that was technically his own, and taken the measure of the man, pardons him on the spot, and takes him south to serve at court. Now, in the versions we grew up with, this is where it ends. The pardon, the celebration, the credits. The old poem keeps going, and does something no film has ever had the nerve to copy. It lets the happy ending curdle, slowly, quietly, and completely. Court life devours Robin. In 15 months he spends everything he has entertaining as a gentleman must. His men drift away until only 2 remain, and the poem watches him watching the young men shoot at the butts, a tamed outlaw in good clothes, homesick for a tree. So he goes to the king with a small, harmless request: leave to make a pilgrimage, just a week, to a little chapel of Mary Magdalene he built himself once in Barnesdale. And the king grants him 7 days, and Robin Hood walks out of the court of England and back under the leaves, and hears the small birds singing, and never comes back. 22 more years in the greenwood, says the poem, for all the dread of Edward our king. 70 young men come through the trees and kneel to him. Welcome, they said, our dear master, under this greenwood tree. In the whole tradition, court is the only prison that ever held him, and he escaped it with a permission slip. None of our bedtime versions ever told us how Robin Hood died, and there is a reason the books for children stop early. His death, when the poem finally reaches it, takes 6 lines. and they are stranger and sadder than anything Hollywood ever shot. Robin, grown old or ill, goes to be bled, routine medicine in that world, at Kirklees Priory, where the prioress is his own kinswoman. And she betrays him. She and her lover, a knight the poem calls Sir Roger of Doncaster, simply let the bleeding run. No battle, no last stand. The poem spends 2 lines on the treachery and turns its face away. And the greatest outlaw in English memory dies in a sick room, at his own family's hands, off the page. The famous version, the dying bow shot through the window, bury me where this arrow falls, that belongs to a separate, later ballad, and honesty says so. But even there the pattern holds. No army ever took him. It took kin and medicine and trust. Betrayed by family, undone by a nurse, mourned by a forest. Now, while those tales were being sung in halls and taverns, the real ledgers of England kept snagging on the name, and this is where the paper trail turns strange. In the spring of 1262, a generation after the fugitive of the pipe rolls, a clerk at Westminster was copying out a routine pardon concerning a small-time Berkshire thief, a man the record plainly calls William, son of Robert the Smith. And somewhere between one document and the next, that clerk crossed out the name the man was born with, and wrote down instead, William Robehod. No one told him to. Nothing in the case required it. He looked at an outlaw's paperwork and reached, the way you or I might call some local rascal a Robin Hood today, for a name everyone around him evidently already knew. Which means that in 1262, more than 100 years before the first Robin Hood story anyone has ever found, the name was already famous. The legend is older than its own oldest story, and that one slip of a bored clerk's pen is the closest thing Robin Hood has to a birth certificate. After that clerk, the name never stayed still again. Up and down the court rolls of England, thieves and tavern brawlers start appearing under borrowed Robin Hood names, and in 1292, as if the story were casting its supporting parts, a robber was charged under the name Petty Johann. Little John in the records, before any surviving story so much as mentions him. By the 1290s, the name had even gone respectable. An honest Sussex taxpayer called Gilbert Robehod, whom one record calls a minstrel, which would be almost too good. And in 1417, a chaplain gone to the bad ran his crimes under a working alias that should sound very familiar. Friar Tuck. The jolly friar we all grew up with existed as a criminal's stage name before any story gave him a single line. And the first time literature itself mentions Robin Hood, 1377, in the great poem Piers Plowman, it is a joke at a priest's expense, a lazy cleric confessing that he cannot properly recite the Lord's Prayer. But I know rhymes of Robin Hood. The most famous outlaw on earth enters written literature as the thing a bad priest knows instead of his prayers. 60 years later, a Scottish chronicler was grumbling about the famous murderer, Robert Hood, whom the foolish populace so loves to celebrate, and, despite himself, retelling one of the tales whole. Robin refusing to break off mass with the sheriff's men closing in, and winning anyway. Even the man complaining knew a story by heart. And the story he knew is the one I told you tonight. The centuries kept bringing the legend gifts, and, this is the wonder of the later story, nearly every gift has a date on it, like rings in a tree. Take the love story we all grew up on. Maid Marian began as a shepherdess in a French play, drifted into the English May Day games as the village Lady of May, and only took Robin's hand around 1510. 300 years into the legend, she entered through the village green, not the greenwood. And the biggest gift of all, rob from the rich, give to the poor. The first time anybody ever wrote that sentence down was 1521, in Latin, by a Scottish historian, a full century after the tales themselves, in the same book that first moved Robin to the days of King Richard and the Crusades. In the old poems, remember, his charity was one loan to one broken knight, and 2 kind lines on a grave. The lordly, disinherited Robin was invented for the London stage in Shakespeare's lifetime. The revolutionary who redistributes wealth was dressed and sent out in 1795 for a revolutionary age. And Locksley, the Saxon defying his Norman masters, that is Walter Scott in Ivanhoe, barely 2 centuries old. And after Scott came the illustrated storybooks, and after the storybooks the films, and after the films a fox with a sly grin. Each one somebody's first Robin, each one true to what its own decade needed him to be. Layer on layer, each with a year on it, an onion 7 centuries thick, and at the center, a ledger line and a slip of the pen. As for why England chose him, of all the outlaws it hanged and forgot, the gentlest answer is that the greenwood is the world put right. The ballad's villains are exactly the things the audiences groaned under. The corrupt sheriff, and the real Nottingham of the 1330s had one so corrupt he ended up outlawed himself. The abbot moneylender foreclosing on a family's land. The official who breaks the rules he enforces. And point by point, the greenwood inverts it all. In the wood, the proud are humbled and the courteous are fed. Debts are honoured to the penny, with interest laughing. The ploughman is spared, the woman is safe, and the poor man is done much good. It is not a dream of revolution. Nobody in the ballads wants to abolish anything. It is something humbler and far more durable. A dream of the rules working, run by an outlaw, because the men who actually held the offices would not. And that may be why the parishes took him in. For centuries, the way most English people actually met Robin Hood was not a poem at all, but the May Games, the church fete, the archery, the ale, somebody's cousin sweating in the green hood, the outlaw of all people passing the collection plate for the roof fund. One great household kept its own troop, and a letter survives from 1473 in which a lord complains that his servant kept these 3 years to play Robin Hood and the Sheriff of Nottingham has run off. Gone, the letter sighs, into Barnesdale. The man quit his job using the legend's own geography. 500 years later, we would call that living the role. Which leaves the question we started with, the one the clerk's pen left standing in the dark. Who was the name? After 200 years of digging, the honest answer is that there are 2 Robins, standing side by side in the same archive doorway, and no fair way to choose between them. The first is the archivist's Robin. There was a man. The fugitive of 1225 was real. the only candidate in 7 centuries of searching who men alive at the time actually wrote down as an outlaw. And his debt rolled through 9 ledgers while Clark spent his name toward Robehod. And perhaps he was the same Robert whom the hired hunter ran down that summer and left hanging in a 2-shilling chain under the eye of a once and future Sheriff of Nottingham. Within a generation, his name meant outlaw as far away as Westminster. Every other English outlaw legend that can be tested, and several can, grew from a real man. Why, the archivists ask softly, should the greatest one be the exception? Nothing to prove it. Nothing impossible in it. The second is the storyteller's Robin. There was never a man to find, and that is not a loss, but the explanation. The name was a coat that the need itself cut, and every valley that kept the rhymes dressed its own man in it, its own forest, its own sheriff, its own bright summer wood. That is why he has 2 homes and no grave, why the very first mention is already plural, rhymes of Robin Hood, not a rhyme. Why chasing the name down through the rolls only ever finds another borrowed name. Nobody made him up, because everybody did, a little at a time, for 500 years, which would make Robin Hood not history's most famous outlaw, but something rarer, the most successful collaboration in the history of English storytelling. And there is a third Robin, of course, the one this whole hour began with. The fox, the bedtime book, the stick bent into a bow in a backyard. If the storytellers are right, if every generation dresses its own man in the coat, then the Robin each of us carried out of childhood is not a watered-down copy of the legend. He is the legend, doing in our own lifetime exactly what it was doing in 1262, finding whoever needed him and fitting itself to their hands. Nobody really told us about Robin Hood when it comes down to it. The name found us, the way it found a bored clerk at Westminster 7 centuries ago, and made us its keepers for a while. A man who became a story, or a story that kept borrowing men. The records hold both possibilities as comfortably as they hold neither. A fugitive's debt, a clerk's slip, 37 quiet years in between. And after 700 years, they are in no hurry to decide. And the places are all still there, which is somehow the most restful part of it. The little river Went still slides under the Great North Road, brown and unhurried, and the traffic crosses without slowing, where the sailors once watched the toll road out of the trees. Barnsdale is hedges and quiet farmland now. Sherwood keeps its visitor centre and its 1,000-year oak, and the 2 counties go on politely disagreeing about him, as they have for 500 years. Kirklees is private ground. Somewhere on the estate a Victorian stone marks a grave that is probably nothing at all, under trees that do not mind either way. And in a climate-controlled room outside London, the pipe roll of 1226 lies rolled among its brothers, sheepskin on sheepskin, and the line is still there. 32 shillings and 6pence, from the chattels of Robehod, fugitive. The ink a little browner than the clerk left it, the debt still, technically, on the books. Far to the north, the light goes off the fields where the old road runs. The small birds the poems loved settle into the dark of the wood. And the name goes on doing the one thing it has always done best, which is to stay. That is the story, the old tales as they were really told, and as much of the mystery as the parchment will honestly give up. And if tonight has rearranged the Robin we each carry a little, Be gentle with the childhood one. He was never wrong. He was just the newest of the tellings, and now, quietly, so are we. Thank you for spending this hour with me, friends. If the lantern has kept you company tonight, the little things that keep it burning, a follow, a kind word, a rating, will all keep until morning. Nothing here ever needs you awake. Sleep well. The wood is old, the ledger is closed, and the name is not going anywhere. It never has.